Hi, I'm Joe Park, CEO of Horizon Stewardship, and welcome to today's webinar, Money in Ministry, Analytics, Data, and Sustainable Funding. This is the third in a 7-part series from an ebook that our friends at CapinCrouse Accounting have put together. We're going to be going through the third section of that today. I am delighted to have with me Stan Reiff. Those of you who have followed Horizons and CapinCrouse, he'll be a familiar figure to you. We also have Dave Gunter, who joined us in the last webinar we did on the section, and they will be introducing themselves here in just a moment.
Thank you, Joe, and it's always a privilege to spend time with you and your Horizons regular attendees to these events, and so I feel like I'm just part of the team and part of the family now. But just by way of introduction, if you're new to the series, my name again is Stan Reiff, and I'm a consulting partner at CapinCrouse, and we specialize as a CPA firm in working exclusively in the Christian space. We work with a lot of churches, Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries, K-12 schools, rescue missions. If it's not-for-profit and faith-oriented, we get involved. And so we're predominantly an audit firm, but we also have a tax division that works exclusively in the not-for-profit tax arena, both in the 990 tax compliance as well as tax consulting. And Dave and I work on the advisory and consulting services. We do everything from executive compensation studies to kind of that CFO function in churches and or ministries, along with a lot of the back office accounting services that many of our clients have decided that they could use our services for. But with that, let me introduce Dave. Dave, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself also.
Thank you, Stan. And I'm also a partner at CapinCrouse. And yes, I've got a background in CFO and Chief Accounting Officer and Executive Pastor, Public Accounting. So all the things that Stan spoke about, that's our daily life. So CFO, controller, but lots of data. And we think about data and analytics in pretty rich ways. And we see it across large, medium, small ministries and churches. So we've put together a few thoughts to be helpful today.
So let's just jump right into it and begin with the data and analytics. What do we need to measure? Why do we need to be measuring it? And how do we do it?
Joe, well, and there's actually a special treat for today. I should have mentioned earlier, Dave and I are both clergy. So Dave's actually ordained also. And so with that, we both have a lot of experience of working with numbers inside the church. And so that's why we really feel a strong calling, if you will, to share this kind of information with fellow church financial leaders and clergy. So, it tends to be a very sensitive topic when we can talk about budgets, we can talk about financial statements, and we may or may not like those, but we understand that's, part of the evil that comes with doing church, right? But when we start talking about donor giving and, the giving within our congregation, there tends to be some really disparate viewpoints. There are going to be some clergy who want to know all the details. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's going to be some clergy, some pastors who, I don't want to know anything about the giving patterns in my church. I don't want to know who gives and who doesn't want to give. And so Dave and I, and actually Joe, you and I were talking about this earlier as well. The reality is this is a critical part of spiritual development, spiritual nurturing, and discipleship. As I joke, every pastor knows who can sing and who can't. And you clearly put those who can on the platform to sing, and the rest of us you put in the parking lot to have direct traffic, where singing is optional and nobody's going to hear it because they got the windows rolled up in the car and the AC going. If you can teach, you're put in a teaching position. If you can lead, you're put in a leading position. The reality is I have a strong conviction personally that God gives the gift of giving to certain individuals. And when he does that, he also gives them the gift of making. So that means that, many times they're going to be an executive in a leadership role of a company or an entrepreneur, a business owner, and they have this ability to make incredible amount of money and they want to be generous with it. And so we've talked about this in some of the other workshops where we want to tap into that church leadership, not just into that church wallet, if you will. So today we really want to talk about not just looking into the wallet and looking at each church attendee as what size ATM are they for the church, but rather we want to look at some of the analytics and some of the trends to help us understand what should we be looking for at a global level, not so much the micro level. Certainly there'll be the opportunity for some discipleship on the individual level, but we really want to study this from a church-wide, church financial health perspective. But specifically, as we get started, we are going to be talking a lot about analytics, data, and sustainable funding. And so with that, well, what is it we should be measuring? When should we measure, and how should we be measuring? That would be the question you're asking, Joe. And with that, let me turn that over to Dave. And Dave, why don't you start kicking us off with that particular understanding? You and I have had some really rich conversations on this.
So I like that double pun with the way you worked in the word rich and money. So I'll start from there. So can I use a lesson from just this week? I know it's only Wednesday, but let's talk about data, money. And the first thing we might think about, Stan and everybody listening in, is the money coming into the church or coming into the ministry. So surprisingly, a lot of us think about the money as being, say, just one big pot of giving. But the first thing you learn to do, and this is the former executive pastor speaking, is to begin to realize I have those donors that Stan spoke about, and they're able to give richly, to borrow your word. And then we have euphemistically everybody else. So one of the early things you learn about is I don't really have a bell curve. I have a binomial distribution. I might have a $3,000 average, $2,500 average for most of my givers, but I could have tens of thousands of dollars average per year for the other group put together, maybe the top decile or 15 or 20%. So those are one of the things that you think about. And just this week with a large ministry, we were thinking through day by day and month by month, what does the cash flow look like that's coming in more and more electronic over time? And what we realized with only a little bit of work was, all the volatility for us was in the big gifts and the timing of those big gifts. If you strip away maybe that first decile of givers and then put the other 90% of people together, it's much more predictable. And you start to think about, Joe, Stan, you start to think about where's my high watermark for cash every month and where's my low watermark and what happens next month. And you start with that base of the 90%, but then you start separately trying to think about when do the big gifts come and is there a rhythm to that? So Stan, that's how I'll start off, just by that double grouping.
Absolutely. And so with that, Dave, so you and I have talked a lot about this as we've talked with so many of our churches and clients. There's within that subset as you're identifying them, you really want to start understanding what's the average gift size within those groups, because you don't really want to lump them together. You might actually even find that you have multiple giving groups, and that's where you start wanting to understand the data. And the more you unpack it, the more refined it can become. Joe, in some of our previous sessions, we've actually talked about some of these giving patterns where they're, more giving is coming from a smaller percentile of the congregation than it used to. But then within that, on the other side, we still have this group who are tipping and or giving infrequently. And so we want to make sure we understand them, because money is never the issue. Money is a spiritual indicator of where the heart is. And as a pastor, as a church leader, we really need to understand this, because giving is a stewardship decision, which is a spiritual discipline. So a lot of times when we study churches, Dave and I, really enjoy getting into this. And when we study the financial activities of a church, we can really quickly understand the spiritual maturation and the spiritual organizational life cycle of the church. Because what we find is maybe new attendees or new believers aren't going to give quite yet. So when we look at the number of attendees who aren't giving yet, that's an indicator of what's going on. And so we want to address that from a spiritual perspective through a discipleship program. Not that we're going to beat them to death and asking for money in the offering plate, but it's a biblical study approach of how to discipleship them in that area and help them gain peace around maybe some of the financial turbulence. Then there's that other subset that are giving at a much smaller level, but maybe more frequent. And then we certainly want to identify those who are giving consistently every month, or that frequency that is really predictable, because then that really becomes kind of the backbone of the church as a great measurement of what's going on. And as you subcategorize these groups, now we're starting to really look for, within those who are giving regularly, what's the average gift? Is that shifting? But for those who are giving infrequently, we want to measure the frequency of the gift. Now we're getting a different set of metrics to help us understand the financial maturity, the financial strength of your congregation. Then certainly that upper echelon, if you will, those who are in the executive roles or business owners and have the ability to give significantly, whether they're giving sacrificially or not becomes a different issue. We want to understand that from a biblical insight of is it really being generous, or are they merely tipping also? It just happens to be their tips are bigger.
Hanging some meat on that, nationally, about 10% of your giving base is giving the majority of your dollars. That's coming from Mortarstone, who processes many billions of dollars of donor giving for churches all around the country. The other interesting perspective, when you look at it from the other side, is about 50% of the givers in a church give less than 5% of the total. So 10 is giving the majority. And we often see that closer to 5%, giving 60, 70%, but half of the donors are giving less than 5%. And that almost never changes in the church. The composition of the major donors, it has to do with a lot of different factors, but that fact that half give less than $200 a year, and it averages about 3.5% in the churches that we work with. I do want to say, as you're talking about measuring these things, if you're not familiar with donor analytics software, this is not something that you have to number crunch yourself. Horizons is partnered with two companies, Mortarstone and Tools for Church, both of which allow, they work with your church management software, aggregate the individual gifts and let you look at it in a variety of different ways. And so the most common approach that we recommend is taking your donors and breaking them into 5 different bands: below 200, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 2,500, and then usually top donors $10,000 a year or greater. The size of the church, what your bands looks like can be different, but when you're using that software, we're really talking about running reports, and even better is if you are using Mortarstone, they've got something called triggers that you set when somebody moves outside this parameter. It sends me a notification. So if I have a donor that is moving, giving away from their giving pattern, either up or down, I get a notification. So if this feels complex, software, $150 a month for most of the churches here at Mortarstone, $99 for Tools for Church. And you can have that right at your fingertip when you see, and you can drill down right to the household level. So I want to put that out there. Also let you know that Horizons has an agreement with both Mortarstone and Tools for Church that you can buy it on a month-to-month basis. You can try it out and only be obligated 1 month at a time, which is different than if you typically contract with them. They're going to want to see a year's upfront. But if you want to try it on, or you want coaching with that, that's the big key. That's the piece that Horizons does. They do the they do the analytics, but it is not hard to get to this information if you have the right software. Without it, and church management software companies tell you that this is available and it's easy, but I don't know of one that is practical for most churches that would provide them the granular data that we believe they need to best manage the kind of things that you're talking about. So didn't want to get on my soapbox, but I wanted people to know that this is really easy to access. It's just, you've got to learn to, first you've got to understand why you want to do it, invest a couple of $1,000s a year to get access to the data, and it will rock your world.
So there's a couple of things there, just a couple of things, Joe, and that is for everybody watching. That data, that software, think about it as the process in the middle. We all have to be faithful just to feed the machine. So to make sure that we're getting the data out of our giving system or our general ledger into that process, but more importantly, to slow down and read it and think. Like the data will tell you, here's your strata, your 5 or 10 pieces. But slowing down to think about it, and Stan, that's where a lot of people add value. Like once we have those numbers and that data, what does it say and how do we think about interpreting the data?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I only can concur and agree with both of you. And Joe, thank you for sharing those tools that are available through your relationship with Moorstone and Church Tools. That's just a great resource for churches to be able to tap into that you're able to provide to them. And certainly it almost becomes risk-free. You know, try it for a month, and if it's not working for you, you're not obligated, the rest of your life, but at a minimum, try for 30 days. And as Dave was saying, you got to make sure you put the data in, and it may take you 90 days or 6 months to keep working through it to understand it and look at your trends. 1 month doesn't set a trend.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to, get enough data in there to start looking at it, and you have to slow down, and you have to be willing to make changes. So you look at the data, and you need to understand what's causing this, and be willing to really take a look at that.
So it might be a good time if we just take a minute, and Joe and Stan, I think you've each alluded to this. Now inside that data, when we think about what do I do with giving data, and I'll speak as a former executive pastor, there are leading indicators and there are lagging indicators. And in this case, a lagging indicator would be, oh, somebody left. They're not here anymore. I wonder what happened. We can all guess one of the leading indicators, and that is that their giving may have been at a level. And had we been watching, or had we used the triggers, we would have noticed, aha, there was a sharp drop in giving. So what we find is often before somebody leaves our nonprofit, our ministry, our church, they sort of vote with their pocketbook before they vote with their feet.
Let me take the counter side, that a lot of times when we don't look at the granular and look for, again, the triggers of a new donor, there's a lot of behaviors around that first gift that within the not-for-profit world has become very, very sophisticated and a great knowledge base, but many churches miss. And Joe, my guess is you've probably taught on this 100 times, and our audience today is probably tired of hearing it, but let me reinforce it one more time. A gift of $100 is a psychological trigger that people are leaning in. Mm-hmm. If you have someone that makes a rare gift of their first time gift of $1,000, they're really looking for some kind of a unique engagement. And not-for-profits are set up for these kinds of triggers and respond within 24, 48 hours. And many churches never respond over the course of a year to that happening. And so we need to systematize within the church.
So we like to say that when someone makes that first gift, they're starting a conversation with you. So the question is, what's your response? If it's crickets, they're going to hear that. If it's that they hear from you within 48 hours, and that's kind of the rule of thumb, and I don't mean an automated response that says, "Dear donor," and it looks like a McDonald's receipt, but an actual touch within 48 hours, will dramatically increase the probability of the next gift. 40% of first-time givers that give that $100 never give again. And the data suggests that it's because we don't respond as a church. There can certainly be other reasons, but nonprofits have learned this, and our dollars are shifting. There's been a major shift over the last 40 years. The church is receiving half of what it used to as a percent of total giving, and the rest is going to nonprofit, some of which are faith-based, some of which aren't. But if you're trying to fund your ministry and do what you were doing 20 years ago, and not looking at these data points to understand the stories behind them, then you're going to lag behind. One of the other points that popped into my mind, Stan, is you spoke about age, and we work with a number of churches. When we look at that top band of givers, that 5 or 10% that's giving half, and then we look at the ages. You can apply an actuarial chart to that and see when the church is no longer financially viable. And if you don't understand the importance of that small group of donors and know their ages, because it usually takes about 10 new donors to replace one financial leader. So you've got to get started really early. And this is the reason that, every day we're closing churches in America, because primarily they're not financially viable anymore. They still have people, but they can't sustain themselves because their donors have largely died off.
Absolutely, Joe. And let me circle back to just one of your earlier comments about that first gift is the beginning of a conversation. And if we don't respond and all I hear is crickets, then that discourages the conversation. Let me take that same analogy and apply it to other spiritual disciplines. If you had somebody in your congregation email or contact you about wanting to be part of a small group and you never responded, they probably won't join. Let me be a little bit more radical. If somebody emailed the church staff and said, "I'm interested in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. How do I start that walk?" and we don't respond, we would never do that with any of these other categories. Why do we do that with the giving, which is also an act of worship? It's a spiritual discipline. It's not a money issue. It's a spiritual issue. And as a church, we really need to get our arms wrapped around that. And please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Giving a gift is not being equated with, come to faith in Jesus Christ. But it's a spiritual discipline that if we don't respond to people's inquiry or the beginning step of that conversation of how to, we're not really doing the spiritual service to those who are engaging us in that initial conversation.
So it really gets back to setting up systems. If you don't have a system set up, you're not going to sustain. One of the things that we want you to walk away with today, or CapinCrouse wants you to, and I want you to as well, is this issue of sustainability. What are these practices that help you be sustainable? So most of the church management software systems, if not one of these donor analytics that I've talked about, Mortarstone and Tools for Church. And by the way, if you want information or a demonstration on those, you can contact us at horizons.net, and that way you can do the month-to-month pricing. But it should be a system that when there is a first-time donor, whoever is going to be making that touch has that information on their desk on Tuesday morning. And when those systems are there, then it's not a great deal of work. So if you're big, that really needs to be automated. If you're a church of 40, it's it's an email to the pastor to say, "Hey, we had a first-time donor. Here's their information. They've started a conversation, and we want to respond."
Absolutely, yeah. And certainly, Joe, and you're absolutely correct. The size of your church, your congregation will dictate the level of automation that it requires. But it does not affect the fact that you need to have a process in place that says when A happens, B's our response. And then one just gets automated, one's manual, but you really, really need to think about doing that to honor, that gift giving, which is critical to the church and its future success.
And you mentioned some of the risk factors that we need to be looking at. Again, those systems allow you to see when somebody's giving pattern has changed. So we've talked about at-risk donors. I think we both agree that following up with an at-risk donor is not about the money. Something has changed, and that's a pastoral concern, and that's exactly how it needs to be dealt with. If you lead and say, we've noticed your giving is off, it isn't going to go well. But if you just wanted to check in with you, maybe you've seen they haven't been in church as much, or you find that reason, but that money is that early indicator that's giving you that 3 to 6 month heads up. We've talked about the new donors. What are some of the other leading indicators that you recommend churches to look at closely?
Dave, you take that one first?
Yeah. So first thing that we have to work with is our attendance, and that attendance could be at the big mothership and then out at each satellite campus. But you want to think about not just the full number, but how attendance is changing over time, and you can start to tell what people in groups respond to. So that attendance is very powerful. I think that most everybody's tuned into that. And I'll remember a certain good pastor who had me ordained as his executive pastor. He would always think about, how many times a week can I reach out and touch somebody? Is it once a week or once every 3 weeks? But he was looking for 1.5, 2 times a week. Might they come at midweek, or may they come to some small group, Bible study, Sunday school, depending upon how you're set up. So that large group attendance is very powerful and important because it changes over time. And inside that system, there are leading and lagging indicators. But then, how many times do I get to touch somebody? And in the same way that we think about, there's this small group of people who do a lot of giving, you could walk that over to another place and think, here's a different small group of people, and they're doing so much of the volunteering and so much of the leadership. So we want to start understanding those numbers, those trends, and think about what the indicators are telling us.
Hey, Dave, can I bring an illustration up to what you're talking about on attendance? Or really the word I'm trying to use is engagement in the discipleship path, worship, spiritual formation, small group, serving, giving, and let me just first say on worship, because so many people are attending online, you need to be having an easy registration for people, QR code, something that they can do to register online. And then be sure you're counting your on demand, people who are watching during the course of the week. I find churches all the time that are failing to account for that. And they find, gosh, we've got a whole group of people that maybe work on Sunday mornings and they're watching later on. So make sure you're counting worship attendance well. But one of our leading churches, one of the largest in their particular denomination, had a data scientist do a study, and they normalized income. If you're interested in how you would do that, I'll have that conversation. But essentially what they were able to demonstrate scientifically is people who came to worship at least one time and no more than 2 times a month gave about 1% of their income. If they came to worship more than 2 times, they gave about 2% of their income. If they were involved in a small group or some kind of hands-on ministry where they're regularly serving or regularly in the community of a small group, that they give about 3.5% of their income. So if you want more money, engagement, discipleship, that is the pathway. And I know CapinCrouse believes that it is not a financial issue, it's a spiritual one. But if you're not measuring engagement, then you don't have a way to know. And I think Stan and I've talked about this before on the budgeting side. If worship attendance is no longer the front door it used to be, because people are now visiting with you online 3 or 4 times before they come in for physical worship. If you've devoted all your money to in-person worship and you're not funding the small group, the spiritual, the mission work, if people are not engaged in that, then it is costing you an enormous amount of money, because the return on investment in discipleship, particularly small groups, Sunday school classes, Bible studies, and getting people into ministry, that's going to get you a multiple, and that grows because people, the more engaged they are, the more they're going to give. The more they give, the more engaged they're going to be. But we have to cultivate that if we want it to continue to happen in our space.
Absolutely. So Joe, let me lean into that, and I'll use your same illustration, because you're absolutely correct. And certainly, we use that same data around how engagement really is the indicator, and their giving is a lagging indicator of where they're at in their faith walk and their commitments. But just like if we had a multi-site church, we wouldn't expect all the offerings to come from the main campus and not even mention an offering or have an offering opportunity at the other campus.
Right.
But we tend to do that online.
Yes.
We don't make it easy online to engage. So we need to think about that in terms of, and we need to be intentional in whether it's attendance and capturing the QR code. Just like, if you come in person to worship, you might get a cup of coffee or a donut or whatever the additional, beyond just being in person together in that really special environment. You want to create some kind of an attraction, or, if you will, the lollipop online as well, that there's something special because you attended and you checked in online. So that, and then that whole giving, it really helps with that engagement process.
Well, connected to that, if you're going to do a good offering talk, and the great thing about online is you can pre-record that and play it while the actual offering is happening during the church, because that's a hard thing to watch. But you can engage, you can have a conversation, a pre-recorded one with your online folks, so that they're not watching the offering plate being passed. But remember, we're not asking for a gift, we're asking for a recurring gift. That's the key, and our systems need to be set up so they default to recurring. So if I make an online gift, it's asking me if I want to make this recurring, and there's all kinds of systems around that too. So I know that's a point of measurement that's important to you guys.
Here's the next level. If you've already taken these baseline steps, is as you start segmenting your giving, you can do it by ages or seasons of life, and figure out what's going on with the college age, the newly married, the young families, the middle school, high school age families, the empty nesters, and see what's happening within your church, and maybe do some comparisons. But more importantly, start having focus groups with maybe the core within that database on what's working, what isn't, and how would we get your peers to get on board with the congregation, where we're going, and help them feel like they're a part and they want to invest in the mission of the church. And now we're getting into some real segmentation by other profile or demographic data. We've actually been able to work with some churches where we do it by zip code. Okay, so these people on the north side of town, let's talk to them, because that's a different community than it is on the west side. And so there's just a lot of great advanced analytics that we wanted to start with the baseline, so everybody needs to at least do this. We won't spend a lot of time on the advanced, but certainly if you're interested, Joe, we could all talk to any of them about some of these advanced techniques that are readily available, but most people don't think about in the same way. We'll do small groups that way, but we don't think about our giving that way as a discipleship mechanism.
Well, speaking of small groups, you can tag people in these donor analytics like Mortarstone. They're in a small group, they're in leadership, and you can see what's happening along your different engagement paths. What is happening in our small group? By small group, we've got a bunch of new givers coming out of that small group. What are they doing? What's successful? And then you can begin to replicate that, or just the opposite. We have a change in a small group or a ministry, and that's telling you every number, there's a story behind it, and we're not after the numbers, we're after the story, because that gives us insight. Getting to the data is easy. Being willing to use it and enter the proper information, that's a key. But getting the giving information specifically for the most churches are keeping up with the individual gifts. So you're already capturing that. You may not be capturing attendance yet. You may not be capturing small groups. But when you see how important they are to your giving, I would suggest that's part of that, 2.0 or 3.0 growth. And that's what we do at Horizons. We coach people with that. You all at CapinCrouse coach people, or coach churches on large engagement techniques like that. So if you're stumped, we can help. And I bet both of us start off with a helpful conversation just to see if that is a right fit.
Joe, let me also give just a little caveat that if this is kind of brand new to you, or you've gathered the data, but you've never tried to analyze it, let me encourage you to just start. And, all of us here on this webinar, we've all done, X amount of data analytics and extraction. We realize, oh, that didn't work. That didn't give us the information we wanted. And so you go back to the drawing board and you try something different. Now, obviously, there's half a dozen or a dozen that are kind of standard that, any of us could share with them, but it's not unusual as you get into these, the 2.0, 3.0 environments where you do a test or an analysis and it's not quite complete. It's interesting and you lean in and then you fine tune it or you add another little data. That's normal. That's natural. That's part of the discovery. And that's what's very unique to you and your congregation, because it's not always just a rote formula. It's an informed discernment that comes with understanding your congregation. And so let me just encourage everybody to start experimenting and looking for data, but just be careful to don't make an unformed decision based on wrong information that you extract because you haven't fully validated it.
So that's a great segue to another point that you make in your field giving guide, and that is engaging your financial leaders and entrepreneurs in the church. They rarely want to serve on a committee, but if you will give them a task, kind of a blue ribbon task, solve this problem, empower them to do that, they will very frequently stand up and do it. And if you're a smaller church that doesn't have a CFO to analyze this, or you're a pastor and you don't feel like this is your giftedness, I guarantee you have people in your church that do this all the time within their own organizations, and they would love to get engaged and examine this data and help you with the cause and effect of what's working well, what's not, what are our risk factors. Because remember that getting to the data is so easy if we use a donor analytics software. Knowing what to do with it, spending time with it. You've got those gifted people in your church. If you've got 50 people worshiping on a Sunday, you have someone that is capable of helping you if you will get permission for them to see the giving donor. And, a lot of churches get worked up about that. Well, somebody will see the giving. Well, the person who's counting the money sees the giving, and the bank teller sees the giving, and the accountants know what everybody's giving is. Make sure they're a trustworthy person. But this is a great place to use them. And again, coaching is available to help get them oriented and get them started.
You're right. We can take that data, and there are ways to extract the names and put a code in its place so that as we're manipulating the data and analyzing it, you can leave the names off.
That's correct.
And just, then you just map it back to it. But here's a great time to bring one of those executives in who may be a sales person who knows how to do this intuitively, professionally, as you call them, a data scientist, we would say a business analyst. And in particular, right now, we're struggling as a church to engage the next generation. They are native technology speakers. That's their native language. They're all over this. And yeah, so certainly we may not want that young kid, if you will, dealing with all the giving in the church, but we can extract the names. They'll be all over the analytics and they will help you and you will engage them and they will now become informed of what's happening. And they, through their own social media, their own networks, will start communicating to their peers in the church that we can do something about this, make a difference if they are empowered, encouraged, and brought to the table.
And those digital natives are now 40 years old. They're moving into their peak earning years. We often think of them as being young, but you know, millennials are you know, they're well into their careers, and we've got 2 more generations behind. I sat with a pastor yesterday who was telling me they watched someone on a staff get criticized because they were spending, in the view of the church leadership, spending too much time on social media promoting their ministry, and it looks like all they're doing is having fun. Well, I tell you, if you're not on social media, you're probably not communicating with that group of people. If you're not having fun, they probably are not paying any attention. So what a builder might think about that is really different than how a millennial or Gen Z might be thinking about that. So that gets back to that segmentation. One size doesn't fit all anymore, and we can get at the data, but you have to be willing to look at it and make sure you've recruited that skill set. What are some of the other digital realities that you've seen that have changed? Much is different than 2 years ago. We're 10 years down the line in the last 2 years.
I'd say, Joe, really in particular, I think, speaking of, you know, that social media and whatnot, that really is a great segue to talk about how do we engage in our community, because if they're not coming to church,
yes,
they're not going to attend church, they're not going to know what's going on, but you know what, they're going to be all over social media. And I think that really is where some of the risk and opportunities come from. So Dave, I mean, I spent most of my time with not-for-profits and some church planting, but Dave, you've got the experience of being in a metropolitan, a large city, as an executive pastor, reaching out to the community. Talk to us a little bit about your experience in that field.
So if you think about the needs of the community, one instructive thing to do is just to go read what the church planters are saying and writing. And they'll talk about mapping out the community, who's there, what are the stores, what are people doing, where do people tend to congregate. And so that's the kind of learning and thinking that lets us start to leave the campus and leave the building and go out there into our mission field, our zip code, and start ministering to people. So that's number one, Stan. But there's another thought that goes along with that. And back at the campus and thinking about the people who come to us, and then the flow of money in and the flow of money out. Sadly, we have to slow down and think about risk. And this is something that we do with a lot of our large clients, and think about a risk assessment. And there's a strange set of words, sort of an oxymoron that doesn't fit together. But if you think about risk brainstorming, that's actually a best practice. If you get together with your team, pull in your first and second level org chart, and just think about, with people being free to speak, what could go wrong. Think about some event. We'll think about an armed conflict on the other side of the world, or some weather event or shortage of gas here. Just start thinking about what could go wrong. How much cash do I have? What's my flow coming in? If we had a disruption of 6 weeks, what would our church look like? It's a little bit, Joe, like revisiting COVID and thinking, if the next item that came weren't COVID, but if it were something else, how would it hit us? And are we more ready or not more ready for it? And what do we do to get ready for risk? We would think about risk in terms of losing dollars, losing attendance, losing people, so we can't introduce gospel, discipleship, life change. but just slowing down to think about all those add-on, knock-on effects, that's pretty powerful. So we would look at the community, map it out, who's there, which ones are we reaching and not reaching, and then what happens, because surely, having read Matthew 24 myself, surely something else is coming and something else is coming after that that will attempt to be a disruption.
Mhm. So this is a plug that I'll give for you all. If you're listening in your church over $1 million budget, I would strongly, your systems are complex enough that you've got all kinds of risk you're not thinking about. And one of the things that CapinCrouse does is, and I think you do it kind of as a lost lead to build relationships with church, is risk assessment for what I think are ridiculously cheap numbers to help you identify the myriad of risk factors that are going on in church. So if you're a leader or a pastor and you want to stay out of the paper, this is a great way to. It's a great few $1,000s to invest to buy a module, let them come in and look and help you set up systems to mitigate that. So one of the big questions I'm getting, you guys are talking about it, is digital funds.
Well, let me go first, Stan. And I think the first thing, and probably everybody is well ahead of this that's listening online right now, but item number one is, instead of dollar bills going into the offering plate or a paper check, money comes in electronically. And you alluded to this, or you said it, Joe. Once you have a significant percentage of your congregation and they're giving online and they have set it up to be repetitive, whether they're pushing it or you have permission to pull it, that is remarkably resilient. And if we think about week after week, whether it's weather, disruption, plague, something unforeseen, that giving continues to come in. And that was a hallmark back at the COVID disruption, along with having online services already, having online giving, and people already set up. Those were two key determinants about what ministry did very well versus what ministry did very poorly during the many months that followed the onset of COVID and all the ramifications and masks and social distancing or social isolation that ensued.
So our coaching on how to set up recurring giving strategies and systems to manage that, that's one of the most requested coaching pieces that we have. And it's our finding that just about any church can get 50% of their regular givers on recurring giving with a minimum of effort. We have churches that, especially if you're a young church and you're just starting, but we've got many, many clients that are in the 80-90% of their donors are using recurring giving. The thing that you need to know, if you're not pulling it like ACH, they're pushing it to you, and it'll turn off. So, and you want people to increase their giving from time to time. So you've got to have now a strategy to increase recurring giving donors giving base, or they'll get stuck there. So that's another risk point you've got. Now you've got them there. That's great. They're giving more than they've ever given before. They're giving regularly. They're giving where your cash flows are now normalized. But if you do not have a strategy to grow recurring giving, to cause them to take that moment and make that electronic change, or to notify them when their donor, when their giving stops, because they set it up and their bank will let them do it for a year and then it ends and they don't know. And it's been 3 or 4 months and you're not communicating. So those are also skills that we need to have. Even if we're a small church, we can do this, with Excel spreadsheets.
Let me kick it up from there real quick. And just as a starting 60 seconds here, Joe, we've talked about all these baselines and the risks. Within this last category, I think the church has been left behind. And certainly I've spent most of my life within the not-for-profit ministry world on the financial and fundraising side. But most churches, or many churches, if not most, have not tapped into the donor advised funds, estate planning, And a lot of our senior church attendees, members, their end of life giving are going elsewhere, not necessarily to the church. We've got to redo that. And then second to that is that new generation are dealing in cryptocurrencies. And there's a new one that I've got clients that are dealing in now, issuing these, and they're called NFTs, non-fungible assets or activities and tokens. And it's a very unique piece. And so I'm seeing that next generation is buying these NFTs, these non-fungible tokens. Ministries are issuing these and they're being sold in auction. And so, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can Google. The biggest one that's in the news right now is Tom Brady's last football NFT. It was a non-fungible asset that was supposed to be attributed X amount of value based on his last football that he threw. And now he's coming back to play again. That value is depreciated. And so there's a whole different world around that as a church, we're not even sure what an NFT is, but ministries are doing it. The world's doing it. And that Gen Z, Gen X, and Gen Y are all in the middle of it. And we will be getting ministries and churches receiving those. And we need to be prepared on, well, what do we do next?
So those of you that take the Horizons blog, we're going to have a series of conversations about cryptocurrencies. Some of our clients are receiving incredible gifts because of the appreciation that they have. And if they're not able to take it, there's some things you need to know about it, like a punk, one of those NFTs are treated like art, which is a whole different kind of giving requirement. So where we're always teaching people to sell something, to give it to us, it may be that you can't receive that. And so you need to get good counsel on that. We're trying to get the foundations we work with to step up, but a quick resource, if you want to just learn, is the Giving Block. They are they're deep into this, and they put out really good material. So we're going to be lifting that up, having conversations about it. I am also have recorded a demonstration of a donor analytics system, Mortarstone, that we'll have out in a couple of weeks. If you're not getting our weekly blog, or if you want to just get the roll up and get it once a month, that's at you can do it at horizons.net or 365. If you sign up for Giving 365, it'll automatically come. And we're going to walk through and actually show how easy it is to get to this data. The hard part is overcoming the obstacles, recognizing the need for it, overcoming the objection. Well, guys, it is always fun to be with you. Thank you for joining us today. Here is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us with questions. A couple of things I want to encourage you to think about. Certainly, if you are doing an audit or a compilation where you want an accounting company to come in and do it, CapinCrouse would be a great resource for you. But I'd really, if you are a church $1 million or greater, I would sure give thought to doing a risk assessment module. They have other modules in their service side that can help churches, but we are, as church leaders, so often blind to the risk that we have in our systems because there's nobody really accountable for that who has the skills to do it. So love these guys. Sign up for their email communication. You are going to receive a recording of this webinar. So if you want to pass it along, that's great. It's going to have the foundational questions in it that are actually answered in the book that comes out on June the 1st. And before we sign off, Stan, Dave, anything you want to add in closing?
Be alert, be vigilant, and use the numbers. So numbers are important. People are more important. The numbers just get us to understand the people more deeply.
Amen. Stan?
Safe. Just thank you again, Joe, for allowing us to be a part of talking together with those who are on the on this webinar. And I just want to encourage everybody. It doesn't matter where you're at in the process. Just take the next step. If you've never started, take step one. If you're even advanced from what we've talked about, give us a call and teach us what you're doing. This is just an open community of learning and innovation. And I just love the fact that we can do this within the kingdom setting to really impact the church and the gospel around the world.
And if you're doing something cool, we will steal it and share it with everybody because we're all in the same work, right?
Absolutely.
We're trying to bring expand the kingdom of God here.
Yes.
Here on earth today. So love you guys. Thank you. And stay tuned for part 4, which we'll be doing next month.